Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new seminar by the Arab Society for Conflict Studies on Transitional Justice in Syria. I am Ibrahim Frihat, a conflict resolution professor and the founding president of the Arab Society for Conflict Studies. Our discussion today will focus on a topic that lies at the heart of justice and peace building in post-conflict societies. It's reparations for victims. When wars end, the guns may fall silent, but the wounds, both visible and invisible, often remain. Civilians bear the brunt of armed conflict, losing homes, loved ones, and livelihoods. Survivors carry trauma for years, sometimes generations. Reparations are one of the key ways societies can begin to address this pain and rebuild trust. In places like Rwanda, Bosnia, and Sierra Leone, efforts have been made to provide reparations after periods of intense violence. These efforts face serious challenges: lack of resources, political resistance, or weak institutions. But when done right, they send a powerful message that victims matter and that society is willing to confront its past rather than bury it. Reparations are not a luxury. They are a necessity for sustainable peace. Without them, victims may feel forgotten, grievances can deepen, and the cycle of violence may continue. But with them, we lay a foundation for healing, reconciliation, and a more just future. For this seminar, we are honored to host Professor Naomi Rother-Yaza, who's a globally recognized attorney and expert in international justice, international human rights law, and international humanitarian law. Professor Naomi, she's a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, San Francisco. She's the author of numerous publications, including The Pinochet Effect, Transitional Justice in the Age of Human Rights. She's the co-editor of A Transitional Justice in the 21st Century, Beyond Truth versus Justice, and Reparations, Decisions, and Dilemmas. Welcome, Professor, and thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. I'm sure they will be very helpful for this transitional stage that Syria is going through a transition from a former regime to a new phase in building institutions and building a democratic society. Our focus today, again, is on this important pillar in transitional justice, which deals with past human rights violations, the people who experienced these violations, forced disappearance, torture, and imprisonment, all types of violations that they experienced under the former regime. How do we deal with their traumas? How do we deal with the concept of reparations, justice for those victims, in order to ensure that the concept of justice, reparations for the victims is a factor that helps Syria transition into a peaceful stage rather than avoiding violence? The very first question that I would like to ask you: how do we define reparations for victims in post-regime change societies? What do we mean by this? How do we understand the concept of reparations for victims?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak about these things. Um, I should say that much of my experience comes from Latin America, so I will be using um, examples
Yes,
from different Latin American countries, but also there are experiences in Africa and Asia that are relevant to Syria. So I will bring those in where I can.
thank you.
To answer your question, so up until maybe the 1980s, the idea of reparations was seen mostly as give people money. And one of the things that has happened over the last 2 decades is a broadening of what we mean by reparations.
Yes,
Some of this comes from the United Nations, especially the basic principles on right to remedy and reparations. Um, but also you can see it in state practice.
yes.
And so now when we talk about reparations, there are a number of different components.
Mm.
Let me list them and then I'll go back through. So we're
Yes, thank
talking about restitution,
you. Mhm.
rehabilitation, compensation, uh, guarantees or measures of non-repetition, and within that, some people put satisfaction, memorialization, and local reconciliation.
Mm.
So we're talking about a very broad spectrum. Now, let me go back and talk about what's in each of those little
Yes,
baskets.
yes, please.
Yes. So to start with restitution. So again, we're talking about a broad view. So land, right?
Yeah,
And in Syria, land would be an interesting and difficult issue.
of course.
Um, but how do you figure out when people have been forcibly displaced, and
Yes,
especially when other people have come in and taken over and sat on their land,
definitely.
how do you figure out how to give it back, right?
Yes, yeah,
Or do you say, we can't give it back, we can't unwind, we can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube, but we will give you other land, right?
yes, yes,
There are experiences going both ways.
yeah. And on this,
Citizenship.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but on this, we need to remind ourselves that there are about 7 to 8 million refugees and displaced, internal displaced in Syria that during
Mhm.
the war that
Yes.
happened. And many of those lost their homes and lands. And this is also an experience, Professor, that also the same example that we had in Libya as well during the Gaddafi regime. And until today, Libya is still struggling with this concept that you raised about how to deal with the land and the properties. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, it tends to be a real problem where there are large numbers of displaced people. The
Yeah.
place I would suggest to look on that issue is Colombia.
Mm. Yes.
Um, Colombia had 8 million displaced people.
Wow.
So it's the other conflict I can think of that had so many
Yeah.
displaced people and displaced over different periods, right?
Exactly.
Um, some of whom moved to cities, some of whom left the country. Um, so what they've done in Colombia is set up restitution courts. They passed a law
Yes.
that created restitution courts,
Yes.
right, where people can apply to get their land back. We can talk later about how it's worked. There's
Nice. Nice.
yes and no,
Yeah.
but as a way of thinking about the problem,
Yeah.
I would suggest that Colombia might be a place to start.
Yeah.
Um,
In Colombia,
so, but it's not just land, it's
yeah,
citizenship. Mhm. Go
if
ahead.
you allow me a brief thing on Colombia, I was in Colombia last year actually, and trying to
Um,
learn more about what they've done on this issue in particular. And I realized the very first step that they established transitional justice law and a committee to draft the transitional justice law. So, and that's one area of it where, based on that, can build the courts that you mentioned, which is probably for Syria, trying to reflect on Syria. This is probably what Syria needs as an immediate thing, is thinking of a transitional justice law for Syria as a start, so they can build exactly what you said on the courts for to settle these disputes. Yeah,
So what in Colombia, what they did was they created a victims law.
yeah,
It wasn't called the transitional justice law. It's called the victims law.
yeah,
And it had the land piece in it, but it
uh-huh,
also had an administrative reparations scheme in it, which we can
yeah,
talk about later what that looks like. But
yeah.
they put those two things together and they left the question of truth and justice elsewhere, right?
Interesting. Yes.
So that's one thing to think about, is because if you get too comprehensive, and this
Yeah.
arguably was a problem in Tunisia, right? You get
That's
too
true.
comprehensive
That's
and
true.
then it gets bogged down and nothing happens,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
So, so finding that balance is
Yes.
important.
Yeah.
Um, so to go back to restitution, restitution can be also of citizenship, people
Yeah.
who have lost their citizenship, of good name. A
Yeah.
lot of times, what you hear from families is,
Yeah.
my son was not a criminal.
Yes.
My son was not a terrorist. My son was a good person. And
That,
I want the state to tell me that,
yeah.
right? Um, it doesn't cost anything, but it's
Yes.
very important to families to
Yeah.
say, look, these were people who had not done nothing wrong, who
Yes.
were picked up, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you might think about that aspect. Bodies, right? In Syria, this is a huge issue, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And what do you do in situations where you're not going to be able to find, you're not going to be able to identify?
Of course.
What do you do about the family members
Yes.
who need to be able to access property, to remarry,
Yeah.
to have custody of their children in
Yeah.
situations where people were picked up by
Yeah.
the secret police, disappeared, never seen again, right? One thing that was done in many Latin American countries that was useful was to create a specific figure of absent from forced disappearance.
Mm.
Because many times when people have been disappeared, the family does not want to admit that they're dead,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Even
Absolutely.
though that's, 99.99%
Yeah.
probable,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
But there's no body. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the family says, you know, I don't want to admit that this person is dead. On
Yeah.
the other hand, I need to move on with very practical things, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so in a number of countries, they created this status of dis disappeared person, right?
Yes.
Which recognized that ambiguity, but
Yeah.
allowed people to, as I said, to remarry, to reclaim their property, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So that's another kind of restitution.
Yeah. If,
Rehabilitation,
if I may
right?
ask here,
What do you,
if I
uh-huh,
may ask here,
uh-huh.
Professor, on the you highlighted a very, very important point, actually, for us here in the Middle East to think about, which is the approach, whether to take a comprehensive approach for
Mhm,
transitional justice, that we work on truth seeking, reparations, accountability, and institutional reform, or to take a gradual approach. And I agree with you, and I researched the case on Tunisia, that yes, it was exactly as you mentioned, it was very comprehensive.
mhm,
They done all of them all at the same time, and the approach that was taken that we don't need to take a linear approach to it. We
Mhm.
can work on all of them simultaneously. But the Latin America experience is telling us, and Colombia in particular, as you said, is probably more important and more helpful, is to take a gradual approach, right? So, with a gradual approach, where do we begin? What are the most important? Should we begin with victims before truth seeking? And the question, if we go with victims with reparations, how can we establish this without the truth seeking? Because reparations is built on truth. How do we deal with this dilemma?
So there are a couple of things that might be helpful to think about.
Yes,
One is truth. There are several different truths, right?
yes,
So there is the kind of historical narrative truth that tries to look at why did this happen, what happened, what happened when, right?
yes,
Who did what to who, when,
yes.
right? There's that kind of truth.
So more
There's
the big questions.
specific, yes, uh-huh. But
Uh-huh.
there are also specific questions. For example, where are the bodies buried? Who
Yes,
is
absolutely.
buried there? That
Absolutely.
is a kind of truth that doesn't require you to have the big picture. It
I,
requires you to create a unit, which is what they've now done in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Peru. I can't remember where else. I think in Chile now also.
yes,
Um, People have come around to this idea that finding the bodies and identifying the bodies and giving and here there's a problem here, which let me just kind of wave at.
yes,
There's two reasons why you want to have a unit that focuses on finding people.
yes.
One is to give the bodies back to the families so that
Okay.
they can be reburied according to religious or other traditions,
Sure.
right?
With
That's
dignity,
one.
to be buried with dignity.
Yes, exactly. That's
Yeah.
one. But two is there evidence of crime, right?
Yes.
And there's a tension between those two things,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
So in Rwanda, for example, there was a lot of trouble because once the bodies were identified, they needed the prosecution authorities to come and do whatever they needed to do as evidence before they gave the bodies back to the families. And the families were understandably quite upset
Yes.
that this was taking a very long time, right? So to think about how that's going to work is important.
Yeah.
Another thing around the
Yeah.
reburials with dignity have been an important part of local reconciliation efforts, right?
Mm, mm.
Where you bring people back to where they were from, and there is a ceremony,
Yes.
right? Right, and the community participates in this.
Yeah.
Has been an important part of both recognition,
Yes.
right, but also of re-knitting community ties, especially in places where people were very afraid and didn't talk to each other,
Yes.
right? To allow people to come out and say, yes, this happened to me, to my family, to your family, to his family, to
Yeah.
all of these families, right? Yeah, has
Yes.
been an important part of knitting social fabrics that have been torn apart.
Yes.
So the issue of where do you find people who have been disappeared and people who have been killed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
both,
Definitely.
yeah, um,
And here
is
we're
an
talking
important
about
piece.
over 500,000 people that were killed during the war
Yes.
in Syria.
So if you were to think of a starting place for truth,
Yes.
right? Yes, you must think about that sort of issue. And plus, the other thing is, we're not asking who, was this person on this side or that side or this organization or that organization,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can do it across the board. And so it doesn't run you into some of the very complicated problems that other forms of justice might run
Yes.
you into, right?
Yeah.
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 Uh, it-
So,
it- mhm. Yeah.
thank you. You highlighted very important points about reparations are done on the national level, right?
Mhm.
Like the big questions and the individuals. So
Mhm.
we're talking about like recognizing also uh, like the cause for what the people went, they fought during these wars. Um, you talked about the symbolism and not only the financial, as you exactly said,
Mhm.
which is very important here for Syria, is to understand when we talk about reparations, we're not talking about just giving money for the victims and their families. It's much bigger, more on the symbolism as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
So is symbolism referring her here to the individuals, to the individual cases, or to the general cause, the big picture, the national issues? What do we mean by here the symbolism, and what examples and what other countries have done on that level so Syria can benefit?
So I think there's kind of two different ways to divide this up, and they're
Yes.
both important.
Yeah.
One is material versus non-material reparations. So
Exactly.
that's the
Yes.
symbolic that you're talking about. And
Yes.
there's, everything from an apology. So the Chilean government sent a copy of the Truth Commission's report with a letter to every family saying
Nice.
the
Nice.
state apologizes,
Very
right,
nice.
in the name of the state, even though we weren't the ones that did this, right?
Yeah.
This was a different government, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
But it's
so, but
important to come
as
from
the
the state.
state, yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
exactly. But
Yeah.
as the state,
Yeah.
we have the obligation to apologize for what happened to you and your family, right?
Yes.
There's
Yeah.
also a whole set of memorialization issues, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Which people sometimes think are kind of the easy part. You just put up a statue and it's all good. These are very political, right? And they
Very,
end
yeah.
up being very complicated.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, but there is this other way of thinking about it that involves memorialization.
Yeah.
Uh, Local reconciliation efforts. So one of the things that's been very interesting
Yes.
in several places are efforts to have people who are on opposite sides of the conflict from the same area or, who have other kinds of ties talk
Yeah.
to each other, right?
Nice. Nice.
And talk about what this was like for them, right?
Yeah.
Without, you did this, you did that, but just
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
was what this felt like for me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Very
And
nice.
those have been quite useful in some cases. They need a lot of preparation to do
Yeah.
this, a lot of work with both sides
Yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
um, with psychological issues, with trauma issues, including medical issues, right? I
Yeah.
mean, people have specific medical maladies
Sure.
when they have been, for instance, the victim of torture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or where, there have been for example, in Sierra Leone, the problem was
Yeah.
amputees,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? A lot of people had had their arms chopped off.
Yeah.
So they needed specific medical care, right?
Yeah.
But you can do that kind of psychosocial support
Yeah.
and then use that for people who want to, right?
Yeah.
And it has to be voluntary,
Yeah.
to be able to talk to people who are on the other side,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Great.
Yeah, this is one of the things that's most interesting to me about what they're doing in Colombia. We can talk a little bit later about that, but
Yeah.
it has been quite interesting. In some places, it hasn't worked. In
Yeah.
some places, nobody wants to talk to the other side. They just, they're still very upset.
Yeah.
But in some places, it has.
Mhm.
Um, so that's something.
Yeah.
Um,
If
the other way to cut this, though, is individual versus collective, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that was, I think, the other part of your question. And
Exactly.
I think there are maybe, this is complicated, but I think there are four different levels, right?
Yes.
One is the individual or family level, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And most of the time, if you ask people whether they want money as individuals or families, they say yes.
Yeah.
But there are problems that we can go into later with doing that.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of different ways to do it that you might think about.
Sure.
Let me put that aside and come back to it.
Okay.
And there's the community level, right?
Yeah.
Our school was bombed, our health clinic was
Yeah.
destroyed,
Hospitals.
right? Hospitals, etc. So there's a sort of collective reparation there,
Yeah.
right? Our mosque was bombed, right? I mean, there are lots of different
Of
places.
course. Of course.
Then there's an interesting thing that was done both in Morocco and in Tunisia, which was to think about victim regions,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because in both places, well, I can talk more about Tunisia because I know more about it. I've been there, I talk to people.
Go
But
ahead.
what they said was that the political opposition to the government, starting from independence, right, um, had been centered in the South.
Yeah.
And so, the South never got any money. There were never any development projects. All the mining was done there. People, they never got any kind of support from government,
Yeah.
right?
That's
Because
true.
they were seen as being opposition, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there was a sort of deliberate underdevelopment
Yeah.
of the region,
Yeah.
right? um, that that needed to be redressed,
True.
right? And so what they did was they said, okay, so this is a question of development plans, right? This is a question of how we bring services to this area,
Mm.
but we want to be very explicit that we're doing this because there was this deliberate underdevelopment.
Yeah. That's
Something similar happened in Morocco,
yeah.
right? There were regions of the country that were very much marginalized, right?
True. Yeah.
And so that's another way to think about what collective reparations might mean, right?
Great. Yeah.
So,
Thank you. This is really excellent, and I would like to highlight a few points that are important for Syria, if you allow me, Professor Naomi, because they come from the Latin American experience. And I am a big fan of the Latin America experience on transitional justice. One is the example that you gave us, thank you, on sending personal letters,
mhm,
like in Chile after
mhm,
Pinochet. Uh, in Yemen, it was done after the regime change of Ali Abdullah Saleh. It was just a general apology. The prime minister said, for the wars that Yemen fought before the uprising, they said, sorry for what happened. That's it. It's just a very
mhm,
general statement, and it was not effective. And
mhm,
we discussed this, for a long time. Why wasn't the government apology that sent after Saleh's regime changed? Why not effective? It was sent to the areas, the territories that experienced the war during the former regime. But here you're adding a very important lesson for us to think about, and in the case of Syria as well, is that there is, of course, it's important the collective general apology, but also the individuals, right, with a with a statement or a letter for those that who went through the experience. And as you also said, that also that their victims were good people, where they fought for a noble cause, and for something that were the sacrifices that were made for. So this can be more effective on that level. And also the other, speaking still of symbolism or the non-material reparation, again back to Latin America in the case of Colombia, where the memorial that can just be taken lightly, as you said, but they added another twist to it that I really appreciated and of how important it is. In the memorial in Bogota on for peace and reconciliation, they built it, they brought soil from all the affected areas, cities, and territories in Colombia, and this soil from each area, and together they built this. So it was a very powerful message. I found it when I visited it, of that bringing the soil from all the different territories that suffered under during the Civil War, and to come in a a memorial that's standing today with the unity of the soil of these territories, which was an innovative recognition in the case of Colombia of the victims and their suffering, which is another thing can be thought about. But let me ask you a question, just to take this a step further on the apology, on the collective level. There is the argument whether to do this from the new regime, the new state, or you mentioned from the former regime and the current regime talking to each other. Can we think of an apology that comes from individuals, right? Not, of course, from everyone in the former regime or the head of the former regime, but anyone from the former regime is to like this kind of to extend an apology. How would that be effective? How other has there been other countries who dealt with, and what's your thought on this of some sort of apology from the former regime or some of the former regime elements?
Yeah. So the only place that I've seen this happen is Colombia.
Yes.
Um, in general, in the other Latin American situations, what you've got is people who were low-level soldiers
Yes.
who usually when they get old,
Yeah.
right,
Yes. Yeah.
and they're thinking back on their life, decide that they need to say something, but
Yes.
not the high-level people.
Okay.
The high-level people have always maintained that they were doing this to save the country from communism, from
Yeah.
whatever,
Yeah.
and have
But
not,
since you like Tunisia, actually, in Tunisia, it came from the former defense minister and foreign minister Kemal Morjan,
yeah,
actually, who was a defense minister who apologized publicly, who was from the former regime, and it
mhm,
was recognized, was taken very well also.
yeah. I think it's very important. The reason why in Colombia it worked, two reasons. One, there was a lot of evidence that the military had done something that was not only wrong, but just unjustifiable, even
I
as a
see.
military strategy,
Yeah.
right? The sort of so-called false positives, right? Where they
Ah,
would
false positive. Yes, that's
where
true.
they would, they would just round up a bunch of poor young guys, shoot them in the head, dress them up like gorillas, and say, "Look how many we killed,"
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And so that's where the apology has come. That
yeah.
that was not even a legitimate part of war, right?
Yes,
That
of course.
there's no possible justification for doing
Yes.
this,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um, and it's been very important to have generals
yeah.
stand up and say, we
Uh,
thought we were doing this for a good reason,
Yeah.
but we recognize that it was the wrong thing to do,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So those kind of apologies, yes, have been absolutely key.
Yeah.
Um, and to do it sitting down with those victims that want to hear it,
Yeah.
right? Because
Exactly.
some victims
Exactly.
don't.
Thank
Some
you.
victims are
Thank you.
just, absolutely not. I want nothing to do with this person. I never want to see them again,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
responsible for killing my family, right? But some people do. Some people want to ask, why did you do this?
Mm,
Right? What were you thinking? Right? How could you do this as a human being?
yes.
Right?
Definitely. Yeah.
And so for that, it's important to sit down and not and the interesting thing is that what has worked has been to say, okay, you thought you were doing this for a good reason,
Yes.
right? But you now recognize that the way you went about it was wrong, right?
Yes.
So you don't have to have somebody say, I was never, I was acting from selfish motives, right?
Yeah.
Because people
Definitely.
will not generally do that, right?
Yep.
But they can still recognize that the way they went about it was harmful and wrong and illegal, and that they want to make amends.
Exactly.
That's the other thing, is that it's not enough just to say sorry, right?
Absolutely.
The
Yeah.
question is, once you say sorry, so now what? What are you going to do about it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the that when you talked about Yemen, it occurs to me that that's the other problem with just saying, sorry, oops, right?
Yeah.
We made a mistake. The next question is, well, okay, what will you do about that?
Nothing.
Right?
Nothing. Nothing
And
was done
so
about it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of the things they're trying to do, and we don't know yet how this is going to work out. This is still a work in progress. But
Yeah.
one of the things they're trying to do in Colombia is to say, okay, you recognize that you did wrong, you apologize, fine. Now, what are you going to do to help repair these communities?
Very nice.
And they've come up with a series of projects, including planting trees, demining, right?
Ah, okay. Great.
Yeah,
Great.
working on demining projects.
Yeah.
Um, I can't remember the others, but they're sort of public interest projects, rebuilding
Yeah.
hospitals, rebuilding clinics, etc. Um, you know, where people can demonstrate,
Yeah.
right? And it doesn't involve jail time, right? But it does involve you have to make a concrete effort
Very
to
nice.
repair,
Very
right?
nice. Thank
And so
you. Yeah.
that might be something worth looking at,
Thank you, Professor
especially for
Naomi.
people who are not, not the top
Yeah.
level people,
Yeah.
not Assad and his little circle, but the people that were kind of in the middle, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, that's kind of what they're thinking of doing.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, actually, for this because I see this is very important for Syria. Why? Because in Syria, it wasn't the case as in Iraq, for example, or in Libya, a total elimination of the former regime. Actually, the top people in the regime, they escaped in Syria, but there were many who stayed in Syria from the former regime.
Mhm,
And today, actually, they have a chance. They have an opportunity is to try to connect to the cases in Latin America and in Colombia, and what they can do for the public good, right? In order to link apology to action,
mhm,
and about revisions of their thoughts and their action and of that, which can give them ideas, right, and examine about what they can do. And I think it can be more effective. And this is not being talked about, right? Because generally,
mhm,
the people think of how to punish them, penalize them, for what they did in the past. And here, you're raising really important thoughts on the approach to reparation, whether it's through punishment, penalizing in the former regime areas, or in order to address reparations, or through serving public goods, more of restorative rather than penalizing or punishment, which can link to reparations on that level. What's your thought?
I, I think it's important to recognize that both the punitive approach and the restorative approach are important because
Yeah,
if somebody does not recognize that they did something wrong, does not admit, does not come forward, does not say anything,
yes,
there has to be a potential punishment there, right? To
absolutely.
encourage people to come forward. If
Yeah,
you don't have the stick, you won't get the carrot. You need to have both,
yes,
right? Uh, so,
yes.
yeah. So, in the Colombian case, if you don't come forward and admit that you were involved in these things and agree
Then there is
that
no
you
carrot.
want to make some kind of recompense, then there is no carrot. Then you go
Yes,
to the regular justice system, and if you're found guilty, you go to jail for 40 years,
yes,
right? Because
yeah,
there has to be that. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
of
Otherwise,
course.
that's the South African example,
Yeah,
right? In South Africa, what they tried to say is if you come forward, then we give you amnesty. If you don't, then we prosecute you. But there was one prosecution that failed, right?
wow, wow, wow.
And then for years there were no other prosecutions. And so
Yeah,
there was no stick. And
yeah,
so nobody came forward to use the carrot,
yeah, exactly,
right?
exactly,
So
exactly.
you have to have
Unlike
both.
Rwanda, Professor Naomi, right? Where Rwanda is more of took a balanced approach, right? To on this issue.
Well, Rwanda, mostly out of necessity, I think. They had so many people in jail. They had over 100,000 people sitting in
Yes.
jail
Yeah,
and
true.
no way to feed them. So, they had to do something. And so they ended up with what they called gachacha, which
Yeah,
they
chat.
called this sort of village level justice, but it
Yeah,
really wasn't. It was really a state sponsored program
yes,
of what we might call plea bargaining, right?
yeah,
Where if you
yes,
came forward, then you would have a reduced sentence.
yeah,
And in some places it worked well, in other places it didn't work so well. There were a lot of local dynamics that influenced,
yeah,
right? But in the end, um, it was probably the only thing they could have done
yeah,
because they had so many people.
yeah,
Um, One of the complaints in Rwanda was the reparations
yeah.
didn't much happen. That there was a
Ah,
lot of a lot of the energy went into creating these gachacha trials.
yes.
Um, so I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
let me talk a little bit about compensation, which is the sort of the
Sure.
money part.
Yes.
So there's two ways to do it. One is a lump sum. You give people a check for a certain amount of money.
Yes.
Uh, could be depending on what kind of violation. That's one way
Sure.
to do it.
Yeah.
Um, could be, extra if you're an old person or an orphan or a widow. That's another way to do it, right?
Yes.
The other thing that they've done in Chile, that's what they did in Argentina, in Guatemala, in Peru. Well, Peru did something a little more complicated, but yeah.
Yes.
In Chile, what they did was they said, we are going to give you a pension as though you had, worked for all this time.
Nice.
So we give you a monthly amount, which right now is not much. It's like $100 a month.
I see. Yes.
Um, but
And
it's every month, right? And you can count on it.
yeah.
Uh, The reason Chile could do that is that they already had a working social security system that
I
they could just adapt.
yes, yes,
Whereas in Guatemala, they didn't have any of that infrastructure already in place. And so it was easier just to, and this
lump
was
sum.
uh, some of the things that we saw in Guatemala, um, intra-family problems. Who gets that check? Is it the man? Is it the woman? Is it
Yes, yeah,
who?
of course,
Right?
of
And
course.
does the man take the check and go out and spend the money and none of it goes to the family? Right?
Yes,
So you
absolutely.
have intra-family problems. In
Yes.
East Timor, they solved that problem by saying the woman has to go,
Ah,
right, get the check and has to bring the, right? And has to bring the children to the medical center and you put
yeah,
it up
women are
there so
more
that the,
responsible.
uh, yes, women are more responsible. There's a lot of social science on
Yeah.
that.
They would spend them on the family, not
Yeah,
on a
yeah,
car.
yeah, exactly. So, that's one set of considerations, right?
Yeah,
Then there's intra-community problems. Why
yeah.
did you get more than me? Why did you get less
Oh,
than me?
yes, yes,
Why
yes.
did this
Yeah,
community get one amount and this community get another amount when the same thing
absolutely.
happened to us? So
Yeah,
there's those kind of problems that you have
yeah.
to think about. Um,
If
there's
I,
a lot of fraud problems. There's
yeah.
a lot of people in Guatemala. What happened was long lost cousins started showing up. I'm your cousin. I've
Uh,
never met you before, but I'm your cousin. Right? You should share with me. Right?
yeah, okay, okay.
And a lot of people going in, especially to rural areas, saying, I can get you reparations. You give me 10%, I get you reparations.
Uh,
Or political parties going into areas saying,
yeah,
vote for me and I'll get you reparations.
yeah,
So
okay.
there's a lot of those kinds of issues, and especially in societies that already work on a patronage model,
Yes, true.
right? It just reinforces all the patronage stuff.
Yeah,
Um, and so that's why I'm not a big fan of individual monetary reparations
yeah, I'm not either.
because of that, because you see that dynamic everywhere, right?
Yeah, and
Um, the
yeah,
other the other issue is who's a victim, right?
of course,
And in Syria, this is going to be a problem,
of course,
right?
of course.
You can already see this is going to be a problem.
Yeah, and
If you
victims,
were in a military organization, are you a victim,
yeah,
right?
of course.
Yeah. If you were
And
in a militia, are you a victim? Right.
And victims come from both sides, because also there have been civilians
Mhm.
victimized on both sides of the equation in Syria.
Yeah.
So this is something that
Mhm.
also you want to take into
Yeah.
consideration. So the material compensation here, Professor Naomi, is extremely challenging because also in the case of Syria, we have to remember
Mhm.
that the country is already struggling with the financial resources, right, after going through
Mhm.
many years of war in the country. And on top of this, there is also the sanctions that
Yes.
are on the Syrian economy that makes the Syrian economy struggles big time on that level. And there is no system in place in order to do that. In addition to all the problems that you mentioned in the other cases, they are all applicable to Syria as well. There's another form that I came to study in Tunisia with the victims is basically to also to give them jobs, right? A
Mhm.
job to earn, like to earn a living, basically, especially for the prisoners who spend 10, 15, 20 years in prison during the former
Mhm.
regime. But then the challenges with the jobs, two major challenges came up. One, and this is applicable to Syria as well. That's why I would like to cite the Tunisia case. One is that what kind of jobs you want to give to someone who spent 20 years in prison with no formal education, no bachelor's, master's, PhDs.
Mhm.
So the kind of jobs that were given them in Tunisia were not, worth or not on the level of the sacrifices and the respect to their suffering that like doormen or gardeners or these kind of jobs that were given. And I spoke with some of them that who told me this was seen as an insult to them, is that
Mhm.
after spending 20 years in a prison and I made all the sacrifices and the job that I get is a gardener basically, on that. So the what kind of jobs that you give them? One, two, also because in Tunisia, one party more like Islamist who experienced more torture under the former regime than others. So if you give these jobs like to one party, then you have more government people working from one party than others, and you're getting into another problem. In
Yeah.
addition to inflating the bureaucratic system with having many
Yes.
people being hired, right? While is the government does not really need, the public sector does not need
Mhm.
all these jobs. So these are all challenges that Syria will have to deal with on that level. And in addition, the big problem with the lump sum that people go spend it in a short period of time and then
Yeah.
go back to square one. So what do they do afterwards? Right. This is assuming that the financial resources are available. So I think more innovative ways will need to be explored in the
Mhm.
case of Syria in order to address this, which is probably more thinking of microfinance, small projects that can be
Mhm.
funded, for families that who suffered, which can address maybe education, like give education to children of victims who
Yes.
were
Mhm.
killed during the war, is something, these something sustainable ways rather than giving a lump sum as in the case of Guatemala, but then they spend it. Yes, women are more responsible, but the lump sum amount will not be sufficient to be sustainable for them.
Right.
So probably this is something also we might need
Mhm.
to consider in the case of Syria as well.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things the Chileans did that was quite successful was they gave educational scholarships
Yeah,
to the children of people who had been detained or disappeared.
yeah,
Um, and also there was, up until a certain age, you could do it yourself. But if you were,
yes,
my age, you couldn't go back to school. That was not
yeah,
going to
yeah,
work.
yeah.
But if you had young people, then that worked.
Okay.
Um, that was one thing that was useful. I agree with you. I am not, as I say, a big fan of lump sum
Yes.
distributions. I don't, what we've seen people use them for in the best possible scenario, people buy a truck and
Oh,
they use it to create some sort of business. But
yeah.
what we also saw was that a lot of people, for example, in Guatemala, took their lump sum and used it to pay a smuggler to get them to the United
Oh,
States. So this does nothing for the country.
yeah, we,
This is not helpful. But there, but there it is.
yes.
So, I don't think it's necessarily a great idea. I agree with you that there are more creative ways. One
Yeah.
thing I will say is you have to be very, very careful to build in transparency, anti-corruption, auditing,
Not enough.
all of those functions
Not
into
enough.
all of these programs because they do tend to um, lend themselves
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
to reestablishing old practices that now is the time to get rid of,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So,
Exactly.
I am a big believer these days in the link between human rights and anti-corruption work.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you
I
if you
agree.
want to uh, protect human rights, you have to build in anti-corruption prevention to everything and be
Absolutely.
really strict about it. because
Absolutely.
otherwise you run into problems.
Absolutely.
Um, in terms of financing, a couple of things that might be helpful.
Yeah.
One thing the Argentines did, because everybody has this problem of there's no money, right?
Yeah.
One thing they did was that instead of giving cash, they gave people bonds, government, 10-year
Ah,
government bonds
very nice.
that paid, a low rate of interest, but paid.
Yeah.
And you could sell them on a secondary market if you needed the money. If
Yes.
you didn't, you held on to them, and in 10 years, they would give you the face value of the bond.
Mm,
Most people sold them, but at a discount. And so it ended up being less expensive for the government.
yes.
I heard mixed things about whether people thought this was a good idea or not. Some people thought it was a way of making people think they got more than they actually got,
I see.
right?
I see.
But on the other hand, it did make it possible to give fairly substantial reparations. The other way it's been done, and this was what Peru did, two things. One was they used asset recovery from corruption cases to
Mm,
finance reparations.
yes.
So when they got assets back, especially from Montesinos, who was the sort of second in command who stole incredible amounts of money.
Yeah.
When they got it back, they used part of it to pay the victims.
Ah,
They created a fund and used
yes.
that for different kinds of reparations. They also imposed a windfall tax on mining because
Mm,
at
mm,
the time the prices of various metals had gone way up. And so the companies that were mining were making incredible amounts of profit, way above what the sort of normal rate of return would be.
yeah.
So they imposed a short-term windfall profits tax. Now, they could do that because it was short-term, because the companies were not actually being deprived of a rate of return. They were still making money,
Yes.
right?
True.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
And because the politics of it were such that they could do that.
Excellent.
Um, you know better than I if something like that would work in Syria. I have no idea. But that was the
Well,
other way that I've seen these things financed.
yeah. Thank you.
You
No,
know,
yeah,
now
these are very important
on
thoughts
the
that
other
we
hand, South
present to
Africa,
this.
they tried to do that and it didn't work.
Yeah, no, these are very important thoughts, what other countries did, that we present for the Syrians to see what applies and what works for them, in case this is,
Uh-huh.
but this is excellent idea.
Yeah.
My last question, and thank you for your patience also, I want to mention, and for all this really, really great discussion. So I don't want to take much of your time, but the very last question that I have for you is, what does reparation mean for the future? Right? What is, how does that, is there any implications for the future, like maybe institutional reform, or how does the future count
Mhm.
for reparations that, if reparations happens, how this might affect the future or not, how this, or will it be, can be repeated, or what's your take on the implications for the future in the case of reparations, if it happens or does not, or if it
Mhm.
happens sufficiently or not efficiently? What's your take on that?
Um, I mean, there's a basic problem here, right?
Yes.
You start out with a set of harms that really are not reparable. There
Yeah.
is no amount of money that you can give me that will bring my child back,
Thank
right?
you.
There
Absolutely.
is no amount of money and even in
And this
some
must be
cases,
recognized.
yeah, and this is the big starting point, right?
Yeah.
That you have to recognize. And even in some cases, it may feel like somebody told me this once and it really stuck with me. I feel like I'm eating my dead. They're
Wow.
giving me money for
Wow.
people who die.
Wow.
It doesn't make me feel good. It makes me
Wow.
feel terrible. So there's a discussion there that has to happen, right?
Wow.
It may be better to recompense people for property losses, for loss of livelihood, for loss of animals, for loss of uh, future possibilities,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But not necessarily for um, people who they've lost, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
so, okay, so on one hand, there's this you can't repair,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's
Exactly.
nothing you can
Yeah,
do about what we're doing.
exactly.
But on the other hand, you have to try, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You have to do something. Why?
Yeah.
Because it's not that money is going to make a huge difference. It's
Yeah.
the effort that's
Yeah.
going to make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Acknowledgement, right?
Nice.
Acknowledging that people were harmed,
Recognition.
acknowledging that they did something wrong and they were still harmed.
Yes.
Solidarity, right? We take care of each other. You are part of us. You
Yeah.
are part of our polity,
Yeah.
right? We want everyone here together. We don't want those that did great during the war and those that suffered during the war, right?
Yes. Yes.
Want them, yeah?
Yeah.
So there's that idea, right? Um, there's the idea of citizenship,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
that
Yeah.
that
Nice.
you are not, sort of a marginal person who nobody talks to because, who knows what they must have done,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
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 The question is about, sort of bringing people back into a polity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That concerns everybody. And reparations is kind of the tangible way to do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Mm, mm.
Right.
Ex-
So that's I mean, plus, there is also a future generations
Yeah.
piece to this, right?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
want future generations to have a starting place
Yeah.
that lets them move from trauma and loss
Yeah.
to a new future,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Reparations is a way to do that.
Yeah. Nice.
Now, that's when the questions about truth and justice come in, right?
Yeah.
And your
Exactly.
questions about guarantees of non-repetition, right? What would
Yeah.
it
Of
take to
course.
avoid doing this again, right?
Yeah.
And reparations is a big piece of it. It's not the only piece, right?
Definitely. Definitely.
There's a whole reform piece
Exactly.
there that has to
Yes.
happen. Yeah.
It's a whole different discussion on a truth seeking,
Yeah, which is a
which is
whole different discussion,
yeah,
but
which
they
is
are all connected, right?
which is another seminar actually that we did here in the Arab Society for Conflict Studies on focused mainly on truth seeking and what it means for
Good.
Syria and how it can be done. So we're building, these pieces together now with reparation. I think we have a much solid argument is truth seeking and reparation with your thoughts and wisdom, Professor Naomi. And on the future, if I may add one thing from my own experience, and through my conversations with one of the victims of torture in Tunisia, which I asked him particularly about the compensation. What do you want for the torture that you went through under the former regime prisons? He was very explicit and said to me, I don't want any money. I don't want a job either. I don't want a compensation. But I want only one thing. I want what happened with me is not to be repeated in the future with my children and others' children's in Tunisia. Right. So though reparation is more focused on the past, what happened in the past, so it's also linked to the future, right? And how to go, it has implications for the future. So this person was mainly focused on the future, like learning from, and that's my compensation, that's my reparation. I'll be happy, of what he said. And in the case, in during the transition, the early years of transition, the Tunisian parliament actually did establish what's called a Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Tunisian prisons. Right, and gave it the authority and to visit any prisoners in Syria and to ensure that torture is not happening in Tunisian
Mhm.
prisons. This was a few years after the transition. I don't know how what's happening now, because also, unfortunately, Tunisia experienced challenges and deviated in certain levels. But was something very, very bright that the Tunisian experience offered in the case on this question of addressing reparations for the victims and the future. So, Professor Naomi Roth Ariosa, thank you so much for all your thoughts and wisdom and recommendations and sharing. We really need these experiences from Latin America. Latin America, who started the science of transitional justice, where it first started. And we learned from Latin America, and we continue to learn today from Latin America about transitional justice, which is where more in different parts of the world today. So, and this is something that many countries in the Middle East, Yemen, Tunisia, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon is still struggling with the forced disappearance and truth seeking during the civil wars back in the 70s that were never resolved. So these are big questions. So to offer these recommendations and lessons learned from Latin America is extremely helpful for us. And we thank you so much, Professor Naomi, for that. So the conversation will continue, I'm sure, in the future, and people will learn more from you and about your thoughts on this issue. And definitely, they will refer to your excellent publications and probably also be in touch with you in the future on these questions, for any possible collaboration. So thank you so much again. We're very honored to have had the opportunity to have this discussion with you here in the Arab Society for Conflict Studies, and I hope we will continue the conversation in the future. And if you have any final thoughts, any comments, so the floor is yours on that level.
Well, first, thank you for having me. This has been a very interesting conversation from my end as well.
Thank you.
Um, Syria has a hard road ahead. There are people all over the world who want to help, but it will be in the end up to the Syrian people to
Absolutely.
think about these issues, to organize themselves, and to use the best of what we can tell you about what's happened in the rest of the world and adapt it, change it, discard it, do something completely new
Sure, sure.
that
But
will make sense in the Syrian context.
don't recreate
So,
the wheel.
yes, thank you very much. Yes, exactly. No need to recreate the wheel, but just give it a little bit of a Syrian touch.
Yes, exactly. Adaptation. You
Because
mentioned the key
every
point.
place is different. Every place has its own. Every place has its own priorities and
Yeah,
particularities, and
yeah,
it's important to start from there,
exactly.
and then let the sort of be informed by other places.
Yeah,
But I'm hopeful that Syria will figure out how to do it in a way that makes sense for Syrians.
I am hopeful
Thank
to.
you so much. Yeah.
I'm hopeful to, and on this good thoughts and hopes for Syria and for peace, sustainable peace in Syria and better future for Syria. We end this on a really good note and good hope for Syria. And Professor Naomi, thank you so much again. And I hope we will have a chance also to meet you in person in the future and develop and advance this thinking further for a better world and more peaceful world, and where peace, justice, and dignity and justice and reparations for the victims of wrongdoings in the past is implemented. And I wish you the best of luck in San Francisco today, starting your day. I wish you a very beautiful day. And thank you again, Professor.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me again.
Thank you.
And have
Take
a good
care.
evening.